Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor Podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
I'm Jason Rosoff.
And I'm Amy Sandler. And today we're talking about a question that we recently got. And this is about something we say at the end of every episode. We talk a lot about in our workshops. And this is the idea of criticize in private. And so the question that we got, this person asked, quote, if no criticism or mistakes are discussed in public, doesn't that create an atmosphere where mistakes are hidden and therefore bad, not allowed, and possibly creates an idealistic picture of the organization, which is therefore fake, as no organization is perfect, end quote. And when we got that question, Jason, you had a reflection, first of all, about the question itself that I thought folks would really appreciate learning how you looked at the question itself.
When I saw this question, one of our facilitators shared it with us, and they confessed that they were sort of a stumper. They weren't quite sure how to answer initially. And as I read it, I understood why it was a stumper. And that's because I think often when someone is new to an idea, they sort of like mush up a bunch of like related ideas and ask a question about three different things at the same time. And that's what I think is happening here. Is this person is asking, I think it's all genuine. They've conflated to some degree criticism with talking about a mistake. Because when we use the word criticism in our workshops and when we've used it in the podcast, we are almost always referring to a type of feedback that is where you're talking to someone about an issue or a mistake that they've made that's affecting their personal effectiveness, growth, or development. So we're talking about the type of criticism that is intended to help someone develop. But this person has mushed that idea up with talking about a mistake that has happened or that the team has made or an error or an issue that has happened that is it would be generally useful to discuss. So it's not about any individual's development, but it is an issue that happened in the organization that's worth discussing so that if someone else were to run into a similar problem, they wouldn't make that mistake again. So that's one thing. The other thing that I feel like is mushed up in here a little bit is the idea of what type of picture gets painted of an organization if the focus is on the positive, if the focus is on the good stuff that is happening in the organization. I think there's a delicate balance to strike in an organization between, because it's very tempting. A lot of organizations have the opposite tendency, which is they over-focus on the negative. So all the public discussion about the things that are going wrong, and then you also leave people with a really bad taste in their mouth. They might feel like the organization's in dire straits because we only talk about all the mistakes that are happening, when in fact there might be really good things that are happening which have equal or higher learning value that aren't being talked about. So I feel like there's a lot going on in this question. And again, this person, maybe the first time they're exposed to all these ideas together, and they've given us a bit of a mashup. So it's our job to like tease it apart and give them an answer to all of the questions that are embedded in here.
I think there may be one other thing that's worth separating out, which is there's a big difference between a leader saying that my organization made a mistake and saying that very openly, and a leader saying this person on my organization screwed up. You know?
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for leaders to own mistakes. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, but like the business school case that's written about the Tylenol poisoning and Burke, the CEO, really being very open with the information about where these Tylenol poisonings were happening. He did the opposite of trying to bury it. He demonstrated what Jennifer Freyd calls institutional courage. And institutional courage is about being very open when the institution has made a mistake, when there's a problem with the product or something terrible has happened, and it's important to let people know about it. So that's maybe I think a fourth conflation within the question. Jason, you're going to say something. It sounds like your dog has something to say,
like
too.
Jack
We want to hear what the dog has to say as well
Jack
as what you have to say.
has some institutional courage.
Yes.
Yeah, he does. I think that's exactly right. And maybe a clearer way of saying what I was trying to say, which is we are definitely not saying that there isn't a difference between a large scale sort of like organizational learning moment and criticism that an individual, we are saying there is a difference between those things.
Yes.
Like, and they absolutely should be dealt with differently. But I think that in my mind, that is the first thing, which is we need to be able to know the difference between those things, because often, Kim, part of what you were hinting at is like, it might be the case that both things are true at the same time. It might be that a single person's behavior drove a significant portion of the mistake. But usually my experience is that is often also there are other problems that contribute to that becoming an organizational issue.
Yeah.
Not just that person's mistake, but there was no check and balance. That person was able to like act unilaterally in some way that they shouldn't have been able to act unilaterally is a really common example of a situation where the organization failed to put the safeguards in place that are necessary to prevent someone from accidentally derailing a project or something like that.
Exactly.
And I think it's interesting, Jason, as you share that around who is listening to what we're talking about. So if you're an individual contributor and you are listening with an eye towards how can I grow? How can I learn from the mistakes that I might be making in terms of my own development? What Kim was talking about was the importance of leaders modeling that institutional courage and really taking ownership for their team and how they would speak to maybe the individual that might have made this mistake, but really taking that broader responsibility, as the leader. So I think just holding, depending on who might be listening to this conversation, what seat, what perspective they might be coming at it from.
I'll give you a concrete example of a time when I made this mistake. I made a mistake that bubbled up to this kind of an issue. And it's not like life-changing or anything, but I was working in software sales and customer service, and I accidentally refunded a customer $1,000 instead of refunding them $100.
Sounded like Kim as a bank teller.
Yeah. Jason and I, you don't hire us to manage your money.
I'm much more careful now than I was then. But I will say, and the customer refused to give the money back. And I was sort of terrified of like what was going to happen.
How into your career were you at this point, Jason?
I was 26, 27, something like that. Now, I went to my boss and I said, I made this mistake, and he was like, helped me understand like why it's so important to be careful about these types of things. But as I showed him, like, hey, here's the interface, and like I can type whatever number I want to in this box. Like it gives me the power to like make this mistake. As opposed to like a refund button that can only refund the amount that the customer has actually paid us. And it was a shortcut the organization had taken a long time ago when they didn't have new employees who were working on this. And so he acknowledged this, but he said, look, I am going to tell people about this because we're not going to be able to fix this issue immediately. Meaning this box is going to sit here until an engineer has time to go rewrite this piece of software. So I'm going to talk to the organization about the mistake. I'm not going to name you in particular, but I'm going to say that, hey, this came up. One of the reps told me that they made this refund. The customer's actually refusing to return the money. Look, no one's paying for this out of their pocket. The company's going to eat the difference. We're going to pay them, like we're going to eat the $900, but I'm letting everybody know that we all need to be double checking this. And so what I'm asking people to do is when they're making refunds for the time being, have someone else check it for you before you submit it. So have someone else look over your shoulder as you make that refund. And we've made this a priority request to the engineering team to get this fixed as quickly as possible. So he gave me the feedback in private. We talked about the situation. He made sure that there wasn't some other issue where I was like, maybe not as focused as I should be. It was a simple typo in this case. But then he talked about the issue in public in a way that allowed other people to learn from it.
I think that's like the best answer to this question. I think we're done.
Very efficient, Jason.
We can keep talking, but that is the answer. I think that is a great way to answer this. I mean, there's more to delve into, but I think that's a great example.
I love that example. And I'm curious, Jason, was this in like a team meeting? Were you there? Like, how did it actually feel for you when you heard no? Was it kind of like in school when the teacher's like, I know somebody wrote on the, bathroom wall and everyone's sort of sitting there? Like, how did that land for you?
So what was really fascinating is someone immediately said, I almost made this mistake yesterday. Like as soon as it happened, Yes, the person was like, they were like, I was hitting that submit button and I realized that I had made a typo in my refund. And they were like, I'm glad that we're like, this is being addressed. The other thing that came out is like other people had filed a bug about this. Like there were many, like in our issue tracker, there were like many examples of people saying like, hey, this thing is kind of broken. And it was sort of like a matter of time before it happened, but it had never bubbled all the way up to like a team-wide discussion. And so I felt embarrassed. I'll be honest. Like I felt embarrassed that it was like my behavior that triggered the conversation, but I also felt sort of gratified to know that I wasn't the only one. And the reaction from most people was like, we're just glad it's getting fixed because this is clearly going to cause a problem at some point. You know, I could tell looking around the room that people were like, I'm glad it wasn't me.
Yeah. I think this is also kind of making me think about the importance of, as a leader, making it safe for everybody to criticize themselves in public. I don't think it's a good idea to criticize others in public, but to create the kind of environment where you're not going to get punished if you raise your hand and you say, hey, I made this mistake, or I almost made this mistake, and I want other people to know because it's an easy mistake to make. And I think that's the idea behind Whoops-a-Daisy, which we've talked about a bunch of times before. But like when we did that on a team that I led at one point, people, again, it was always in customer support, and someone raised their hand and they said, here's a danger of multitasking. I was writing my girlfriend at the same time I was answering customer support tickets. And I accidentally, in the customer support ticket, wrote love, my name. And it was a funny story, but it was also like all of us could imagine making that mistake. And it's useful to just sort of talk about those mistakes.
Yeah, I think if honestly, what I love about Whoops-a-Daisy is it like creates it by design sort of lowers the stakes. Like you're taking this sort of silly thing and you're pairing with a thing that might actually be sort of embarrassing or difficult to talk about. It like creates a little bit of, it's sort of like if you've ever had if you're afraid, someone who's afraid of shots, like getting an injection, sometimes they tell you pinch yourself somewhere else. And it like confuses your brain for a moment so that you can actually deal, like it's less sort of terrifying. You don't feel the pain the same way. I feel like Whoops-a-Daisy does a similar thing. It's a bit of an anesthetic almost to having
it's emotional Novocaine. We've been looking for that.
There it is. Well, and just for if anyone, I can't imagine this is somebody's first podcast, but if they are new to Whoops-a-Daisy, Kim, do you want to just in a sentence or two explain what the role of Whoops-a-Daisy is and how you introduced it?
Basically, I would bring in a stuffed animal and I would say that whoever made the biggest mistake this week gets the stuffed animal, and I'll start and I'll share something I screwed up this week. And then I would put $20 in the early days on the stuffed daisy so that just because it gave people plausible deniability for playing along. And then people would raise their hand and share a mistake that they made. And the idea was that if we talk openly about mistakes, and I think we talked last time about the right kind of wrong, but you could also share a mistake about the wrong kind of wrong. Like multitasking is not the right kind of wrong. That's the wrong kind of wrong, but it's a human kind of wrong. And so the point was we want to make it safe to make mistakes so that we can share with each other about the kind of mistakes we make. And also so that we can take risks. You don't, if there's too high a penalty for failure, then people won't be self-critical and they won't offer each other criticism in private. But you can criticize. Another exception to criticize in private is you can criticize yourself in public. Just don't criticize another human being, another person in public.
And just you're referencing, we had such a rich conversation with Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmondson on the right kind of wrong. And also just this idea of how criticizing or shaming someone in public is more likely to make that person more likely to hide mistakes in the future, which is hurting not only them and the company. And so really what we're talking about is how can we honor our concern for the individual, for their growth with the needs of the team. Jason, when you reflect back on that story with your boss, I'm curious, the Whoops-a-Daisy, is that something that you could have imagined then at the next meeting could kind of have become, like, would you have imagined the boss could then start bringing in a Whoops-a-Daisy, or how would someone start implementing that based on what you went through in that team meeting?
I mean, I don't want to say unfortunately, but I think the reality was that that team was not very psychologically safe. Like
Mhm.
there was not a lot. Like my boss at the time did a lot from my perspective to help increase our sort of sense of trust and safety. But like in general, that environment was a very difficult one, and there was a lot of sort of like public blaming and shaming that went on inside that company. And
Mhm.
so I think it would have taken a lot, I think, to get people excited about the idea at that moment, at the time that this mistake happened. I think it would have been a lot to believe that people would sort of accept Whoopsie-daisy, but I don't think it would have been impossible. And so, in my mind, there are some other options of things that you can do, even if you're not ready to sort of proactively take responsibility or responsibility for a mistake. There are some other approaches out there, and we can link to these in the show notes. But one of the ones that we used a lot at Khan Academy was what's called a blameless retrospective. And a blameless retrospective is really like the whole idea of it is to take a deep look at something that has gone wrong, and to report on it in a very matter of fact way. To say these are without naming people, without worrying about who did what, but just to say here's an accounting of what happened. Here are the things that went wrong. Here are the steps that we took. This is the corrective action that we took, and here's the end result. Is essentially like the rhythm of a blameless retrospective. And the goal in that is very similar, is without requiring people to take personal responsibility, to get people to talk about the mistakes that happened and also talk about the solutions. The orientation of both Whoops-a-Daisy and a blameless retrospective is learning as opposed to worrying about the mistake, right? Is like,
Mhm.
how can we learn from this thing that went wrong?
Which is very much the focus in our conversation with Amy Edmondson, was really that learning mindset. One of the things when you responded to the initial question was about distinguishing between kind of large scale problems in an organization versus issues that are really about kind of personal effectiveness, personal development. And it sounded like your boss was speaking to your own development so you wouldn't make that mistake again. What you were just talking about now with the sort of blameless retrospective, mistakes and problems that are significant enough to be talked about publicly, which are often caused by things like poor planning, lack of oversight, or process design. And you've stressed the importance of these needing to be public and transparent. And I'm curious, who in the organization, who in relationship to the issue that kind of transpired, who is responsible for that blameless retrospective? Would that have been your boss in that case?
If we're using my example, I would be my boss because the team was small enough that there wasn't like some other sort of manager of the work. He was managing the work and he was managing the people in that case. But there are some other situations where we use them at Khan Academy where there was different managers of the work, the managers of the people, and the managers of work ran the retrospectives,
Mhm.
not the managers of people, explicitly to separate it from performance management, to really have it be about organizational learning and development.
Kim, anything?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's coming to mind for me is I can't remember now whether it was Apple Maps or some other, but there was some problem with the iPhone. And it was a big brouhaha. And Steve Jobs came back from vacation and in order to sort of lead the communication about it. And he said, "We are not perfect. Um, you know, we are human beings. We are not perfect. We make mistakes. And this is a mistake we made. And we'll take, if you don't like the phone, return the phone and you'll get a refund. And it was like shaping up to be this huge crisis. And I think it was an example of taking accountability for a mistake that had been made. I think the mistake was Apple Maps, but I don't remember now. But I do remember that the person who had actually done the work, who was responsible for, did not step up and take responsibility. Steve Jobs had to do it. And I remember thinking, it would have been much better if the person who was responsible for the work were taking responsibility. But maybe it was the CEO's job to take the fall, to say, look, the buck stops here, and I made a mistake too. And so I don't know whether that's an example, but it was a large scale problem that
Mhm.
that they had to own it in order to get past it.
as we were talking about this, like the other, maybe because I used a financial example, but the other thing that was coming to mind was Barings Bank, which essentially
Yeah.
the story of Barings was that it was collapsed by a single 28-year-old trader who made some mistakes, who created losses, and then hid those mistakes, which
Yes.
compounded because other people. Essentially, what happened was he lost the bank a bunch of money, but he was able to hide the mistake. So as far as everybody else was concerned, the bank still had $1 billion that he lost, and so they compounded their losses because other people were operating as though that $1 billion was still there.
Yeah.
You have to imagine that there was there's something that was missing there, right? Like some process of accountability where it was basically like, we want to know when mistakes are made as early as possible so that we can avoid compounding on those mistakes and putting, jobs and, the business in jeopardy. But when that's missing, it actually doesn't, it's such he wrote a book, I think, Nick Leeson, I think is the guy's name,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, he shouldn't have been able to
Correct.
take the bank. Yeah. There was a systemic failure.
Correct. And I think that's an extreme example, but I think those systemic failures happen all the time. And unfortunately, organizations don't actually learn from them because there's such a premium put on sort of saving face or feeling sort of defending your reputation that you don't want to talk about mistakes. And that's how they easily kind of compound on themselves and create really dangerous situations. I keep thinking of like how the experience of my boss sort of like fixing this mistake twice, right? Which was one was, we attempted to resolve it with the customer. We couldn't. That was step one to trying to fix it, like get the money back and try to fix the immediate problem. But step two was like, we're going to fix the software so that other people can't make this mistake. And without step two, it was really easy for someone else's mistake could have been way bigger than mine, right? It was actually really easy for someone to make a worse mistake than the one that I made. And I feel like that organizational courage, the willingness to admit that problem existed, the fact that he did it and took responsibility for making sure that it was going to get fixed, all of those things took some of the heat out of other people raising their hand and saying like, oh, actually, I noticed this problem here, or I made a similar mistake.
Yeah, in some ways, by sharing the fact that this happened, by not saying who made the mistake, but saying it is a problem with the system, not a problem with the person who made this, he created an environment, even in where people could say, "Oh yeah, I made that mistake," or "I almost made that mistake."
Yep.
So there was some psychological say. So it was kind of a whoops-a-daisy moment.
Yes, and he built it on the fly. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
We can go back to, I think, one of the questions that came from this workshop participant. How do we distinguish between debate that has to happen publicly and criticism? And I know we've got some podcast episodes for you on our Get Stuff Done Wheel debate episode, which we can put in the show notes. But I do think it would be helpful just to touch lightly on a couple of examples of what's an example of let's have a public debate about something versus let's have private criticism. Jason, what's the first example that comes to mind for you of that distinction?
Well, I think of like product or feature launches that didn't go as planned or didn't go well. This is a place where it's like, is it criticism or is it a mistake that we made? Are we having a debate about what to do? You know what I'm saying? Like it's hard to know what to do, but I think a common thing that would happen is we'd be like, oh, we tested this and it did really well in testing. We launched the feature and we don't see the same usage that we saw beforehand. And the question is like, did we make a mistake? Well, we might run a retrospective to say like, okay, why are we seeing different results now than we did before? The place for debate often comes from what do we do with this information? Now that let's say we recognize that we made a mistake. The debate is how do we apply this knowledge that we've acquired to some new decision? So I'll give you, let me try to make the example more concrete. So Khan Academy, we built a feature that allowed people to track their progress across multiple sessions. And what we saw was that initially it increased people's activity. meaning they came back more often to see, because they got to see their progress increase. But when we launched it, it didn't have the same effect in the general population as it did, like the broad user base of Khan Academy, as it did in the smaller user base that we were testing with. And what we discovered is that we had chosen a bias sample, essentially. We'd chosen to test with a group of people who were more likely than the general group of users to spend more time on Khan Academy.
Jason, can I ask you a question on that? If 25-year-old Jason was responsible for creating that test and used the bias sample, so let's say that was a mistake.
Yep.
You sort of had sample 1, sample 2, you went for sample 1. How would I, as your boss, articulate that failure in a way that supports your personal development, doesn't shame you, and helps learning on the team?
So in this case, like I was the boss, and I criticized myself. I was like, this is like, it was annoying to me that when we launched the feature, it was not performing as well as it was when we were testing it. And I was like, what is going on here? And I wanted to know the answer, and I want other people to know the answer because I didn't want other people to deal with the same sense of frustration. I made the decision, even though I knew it would reflect on me, to like have this, to do like a something very similar to like a blameless retrospective on what happened, and to commit to sharing the results publicly in the organization. I think from a development perspective, what I was going to say was I didn't actually know exactly what to learn from it, because the hard part about the bias sample is it's very hard to get people to beta test stuff. Like, it actually does require some inertia, like the breaking through some inertia, to get someone to say like, I'll help you, and I'm going to test your software. So there's some natural bias to the sample of people who are going to beta test. And the debate that came after this was, do we correct for the bias? Do we change the sample? Do we change our process in some way? Or do we accept that there's going to be some bias? And so we come up with some way to correct for that bias in our analysis, because we'd rather work with people who are excited to give us feedback, or willing to put in the extra effort to tell us where we're getting stuff stupidly wrong when we're releasing new features. And that debate was really helpful, because I actually, from a developmental perspective, I was like, is this something that I should know? Is there an answer to this? And it turned out there wasn't a great answer to it. And it was only through that public debate that we came to a decision as a team about how to handle these things going forward. And we decided to keep using the sort of bias sample for at least part of the testing process, and then have a way to sort of put corrective goggles on to like look at the results from that test and see them more in a way that was more likely to align with what would happen when we launch public.
I love that story, and I'm curious, just to go back to sort of Jason as boss and Jason as individual contributor. If you had not been the boss in that case, if you had been running it, but you were really relatively new on the job, like how would you have handled it, and throw in maybe an environment closer to your other company, which wasn't quite as psychologically safe?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I was incredibly fortunate in that situation to work with a bunch of people who were equally curious, like who just wanted to know why the thing happened, and weren't so worried about why we got it wrong, but were more interested in understanding why it happened. I think if I rewound to my other story, my other boss, I think he probably would have tried something similar. But if I expanded out to the company at large, where things were less psychologically safe, I think what was very likely to have happened on another team, for example, is that someone would have been blamed for the mistake. Meaning, someone's data analysis wouldn't have been sufficient. Someone would have failed to anticipate. Like, there would have been a thing which was very sort of like blame, and not learning focused, but blame focused, to say like, this mistake happened and it'll never happen again, because so and so will never do another analysis of this kind at this company. It sounds like a joke, but I guarantee you there are people listening right now who work in companies where those kinds of emails go out publicly.
And I think what is the who and the what are really important. Like, it's not who did wrong, but what went wrong. And it is going back to the previous, like, let's look at the systems. What went wrong with our systems? And I think that's really important when having a debate, is you're talking about the what, not the who, when you're having a debate. With the exception of if you're debating whether or not to hire someone. But usually you're talking about, and then hopefully you're talking about why, not the who, not the person's who they are, but what are they going to do here? I think also something about debate. I mean, you were debating retrospectively something that happened in the past, but very often when you're having a debate, you're talking about the future. You're talking about something new you're going to do. Should we enter that market or this market or that market? Should we build this new thing or not build this new thing? And I think that if you're going to have that kind of debate, there's a world of difference between saying, I don't think we should enter this new market for these, and these reasons. But if I think that the person I'm having the debate with has some sort of ulterior motive for entering that market, like that is a criticism that I need to talk with them about in private, not in public. So that's a simple way to think about the difference between debate and criticism.
Yeah, putting it back into my example, I think what I was trying to describe, our debate was about the future, and it was about, should we continue to beta test in the way that we have?
Yeah, given this past mistake. Yeah.
A way that could have gone wrong, like you are describing, is if the person who engineered the system got defensive and said, we shouldn't change anything because, the system we have is so great, and there was the motive might have been a fear of, having to change a thing that they designed or something. Like they might have been holding on to something. That criticism could have needed to be given to the person so that the debate could continue in a constructive way.
Yeah, and I think another important thing about debate, which again does have to happen in public, is that you want to make sure that you're organizing your debates in such a way that you can never take ego out of a conversation because you got a group of people talking, but to the maximum extent possible, you're structuring it in a way that takes ego out of the equation. So another important thing I learned about debate when I was working at Apple is when the product and engineering teams were having debates about, should we build this or should we build that? People would come with data, but not with recommendations. And that was really important because you're less likely to get your ego attached to data than you are likely to get your ego attached to your recommendation.
Yep.
And so I think sometimes we want to take like a high school debate approach, and then, people do come with recommendations. But that was to me one of the bigger ahas I got about how Apple would approach. I mean, didn't always work out that way, but in the ideal Apple, how people would approach debate.
Before we get on to our tips, if we have an example from sports, I'm curious if there's an analogy we can make in the workplace, or if it doesn't hold. So, for example, a kind of correction that you need to do immediately and in public, and that's criticism. So, for example, if the coach is yelling at a player in the middle of the game, maybe the only way to correct them, they need to, run back or go in front of the goal, etc., rather than yelling that feels like bullying. And so is it the context in which this is happening, that this is coaching and it's very obvious, you're going to be offsides unless you come back? Like, is there a workplace equivalent?
Yeah, I think this is really important. So there's a big difference between a correction, which needs to happen in public, and criticism. And so, for example, here's when I wrote Just Work, which is now called Radical Respect, I talk about the importance of correcting bias publicly. And this makes people uncomfortable because it feels like public criticism. But I think the approach that I try to make is, if you notice bias, somebody saying or doing something biased, it's a quick correction, and it's important to make it in public in the moment, because if you don't, then you reinforce that bias. And so it's not exactly like getting called out on a baseball team, but you'd rather have your coach yell at you back than get out.
A common example that happens in clients' services is someone mispronouncing someone's name.
Yes,
which can be caused by bias, because people might read a name in a way that is like more Western, for example.
Yeah.
I would always rather that someone like gently but firmly
correct
like
me
say
in the moment.
person,
Yeah.
right, say the person's name. I think you meant to say, Sandler, not Sondler. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be a big thing, but those are examples I think of the types of corrections you do want to have happen in the moment.
And Jason, do you think it's more helpful if someone else says it rather than you? Like in terms of like having an ally or upstander, Kim, to use your frame.
I think the purpose of having someone else say it is like you don't know that you're doing it wrong, right? Like you don't realize.
No, I mean
that
if it's multiple people.
Would you rather have me tell you, Jason, that you mispronounced Amy's name, or would you rather have Amy tell you?
That example, I think I'd be fine with either of you saying it. I also think it's hard to separate our relationships from that question. Like, I think if the person was a stranger, I think I would be slightly more embarrassed if the person themselves corrected me as opposed to someone else correcting me. I would feel slightly more embarrassed, but that wouldn't change how valuable, like how much I appreciated getting the feedback.
That's interesting. Kim, would you have the same feeling that you would be more embarrassed if it was the person themselves versus an upstander?
I think I don't, it depends on what the topic is. If it's a name, I don't think I would care. But if I said something, let's say I said something that was racist inadvertently, would I rather hear about that mistake? And I want someone to point it out publicly because I don't want to do that again. That's not something I want to reinforce. Would I rather have a white person or a black person point it out to me? I would like to say I don't care, but it would probably be easier to hear from a white person.
Yeah.
I would probably feel less defensive or shamed. But I don't know. I mean, I don't like to admit that because I wish it weren't true, but it probably is true. And that's why I think that upstanders have a real advantage in making these kinds of public corrections, because it's a little bit easier to hear from someone who is not the person who you just heard. Creates a little bit of distance.
I think that's exactly why I would feel that way about the name. I think I'm maybe personally sensitive to that because I have a name that people routinely mispronounce. And I feel like I'm always correcting. And I always there's a twinge inside when I'm correcting somebody else about how to pronounce my name, where I'm like, I don't know. I sort of feel defense. I don't know exactly what it is.
I always try to correct people when I notice that they've mispronounced your name.
Kim, do you want to pronounce Jason's name properly for our
Jason Rosoff? Did I say it right?
I'm
gonna get it wrong.
We made her nervous by putting her on the spot.
I really put her on the spot.
It's the danger.
This is where she earns the big bucks. Are you really co-founder with this guy?
This person whose name you can't pronounce. But I did mispronounce your name when I first met you, actually.
It's incredibly common. Like it's not phonetic. Or I should say, the rules of phonetics are unclear when it comes to pronouncing my name. There are at least two ways that you could pronounce it, which appear to be phonetically correct.
Yeah,
and it's in part because my name is an Americanization of a Slavic name, of a Russian name, and so it's not pronounced exactly. So technically, Rosoff is a mispronunciation. Rosoff is the Americanized version. It'd be much closer to Rossoff.
Which is why I pronounce it wrong.
Yeah.
Since I'm a
that's right. We have a Russian expert.
It's not really.
But the point is, it is sometimes hard. I'm admitting that it's hard. It's sort of tiresome for me to correct other people's mispronunciation of my name. And I think the same thing is true for a lot of the Black folks that we've talked to. It's tiresome to point out someone's biased behavior. Yeah. And if you're aware of that and sensitive to that, I think that might be another factor as to why it might be easier to hear it from an upstander. Because when you hear it from the person directly, you know, oh, I've just done this thing where I've placed a tax on this person's day by putting them in a position where they have to correct me.
Yeah,
you don't want to be putting them in that position. At the same time, you're much better off knowing that you made the mistake.
Did you know that my last name, Scott, was actually not Scott? It was Schutt. It was Dutch. And my husband's grandmother got so tired of correcting misspelling and mispronunciation that she just changed the name for herself and her husband. It wasn't her last name either. She changed it to Scott because she got so tired of it. So it's exhausting. It's pretty damn hard to change your name. So imagine how exhausting it must have been for her to correct it all the time.
It is a common story. Like among my immigrant friends, like the number of people who have a story similar to that in the last 1 or 2 generations of changing their name to stop dealing with people not being able to pronounce it.
But let's now put the less of the burden on the person who has
be an upstander.
Yeah, let's be an upstander. Let's learn how to say people's names in their original form.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, let's move on to our Radical Candor checklist. And these are tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor into practice.
Tip number 1, it's okay to offer corrections in public. So, for example, if you notice bias, flag it in the moment, especially if you're the upstander.
Tip number 2, clarify the difference between criticism that's focused on personal development and healthy debate, which we want to encourage in public. Personal development criticism should happen in private, help lower the shame and defensiveness, support learning, while debate should happen in public and be focused on ideas rather than people, egos, or personality attributes.
Tip number 3, don't be afraid to talk about mistakes in public. Leaders should not be afraid to own the mistakes that get made on their team, especially when other people could benefit from learning not only about how the mistake was made, but how to avoid it in the future.
Shall we talk about our favorite things?
All right. Now for some of our favorite things. In my continuing quest to eliminate single-use plastics from my daily life, I'm now using this cool dental floss that is made out of bamboo, and it comes in a cute little glass jar with a metal top, and it's called Boonboo Dental Floss. It's bamboo charcoal woven dental floss. So we'll drop a note to that.
Speaking of difficult names to pronounce, do you want to...
Boonboo, I guess.
Boonboo.
Boonboo Dental Floss, yes.
All right.
And it has a cute little panda bear next to some bamboo on it.
Well, you know we love dental floss. At one of our, back in our days when we were touring the world and had some marketing materials, we had Radical Candor Dental Floss because, you know, Kim, you want these conversations to be like brushing and flossing, not like a root canal.
Yes.
You also like to talk, we also like to do a spinach in our teeth exercise. There's a lot around, you do have a fondness for all things dentistry.
I will say I also tried, in the spirit of Radical Candor, I also tried the Boonboo bamboo toothbrush.
Tutu?
And the head of the toothbrush broke off, and I stabbed my cheek with a sharp bamboo stick. So I think they have some work to do on their toothbrush.
What happened to not criticizing in public, or is this a blameless retrospective?
This is a product. I'm not criticizing a person.
That's right.
But I do love, and I'm earning credibility here. I really do genuinely love the dental floss. It works.
Kim, has your dentist ever told you that you might be brushing too hard? I get that criticism. My dentist is like, you're too vigorous with the brushing.
I do not get that criticism because I don't brush very hard, but I do criticize my husband. Now I'm criticizing in public, which I shouldn't do. Well, I worry that he brushes too vigorously. I worry for his gums.
That's
well, maybe Andy and Jason can have a sort of thought partnership and support each other with their brushing challenges.
I can't tell him directly this anymore because he's sick up here and about it. So I hope he doesn't listen to this episode.
Well, that's why we got this podcast, Andy. Yes. Sorry about that. All right. Well, if you're actually looking for some Radical Candor tips, that's at radicalcandor.com/resources. You probably know it, but check it out if you don't. We've got free learning guides. You can get Radical Candor on Masterclass, our lit video book, and of course, our workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, and more. Show notes, go to radicalcandor.com/podcast. Just like we were talking about, we talked about criticizing in private and praising in public and private. So if you do like what you hear, just like the Boonboo Dental Floss, go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. If you have criticism for us, we welcome it. Please email it to podcast@radicalcandor.com. we've been getting some really helpful criticism, such as around some of our advertising and where that was plopping into the show.
Interrupting
mid-sentence.
us.
It was
I'm the only one allowed
Kim
to
is the
interrupt.
not these
the
ads. So thank you for letting us know, so Kim can keep her throne and reign as the
Chief
consummate interrupter. Bye for now.
Take care,
everybody.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor: Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal, with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the Company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.